You should know where you stand!
The private dining room on the 42nd floor of the Whitmore Tower was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel small the moment they stepped inside. Floor-to-ceiling glass looked out over a city that glittered like a spilled jewelry box, and every surface, every polished marble countertop, every crystal chandelier, every hand-stitched linen napkin folded into the shape of a swan, had been chosen with the specific intention of reminding guests exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of the world. Tonight, the room held 22 of the most powerful people in the city, gathered at the personal invitation of a man who did not give invitations lightly. The air smelled of fresh orchids and expensive ambition. Somewhere beyond the double doors, in the gleaming corridor of stainless steel and flame, a woman stood at a prep station without anyone knowing her name. Her name was Maya Johnson. She was 32 years old, and if you had passed her on the street or even in the kitchen that night, wearing her pressed white chef's coat and her hair pulled neatly beneath her cap, you might not have looked twice. She did not carry herself with the self-conscious pride of someone who wanted to be noticed. She moved through her workspace, the way a surgeon moves through an operating room, precise, calm, entirely focused on the task directly in front of her. A touch of salt here, a reduction adjusted with the kind of instinct that cannot be taught in any culinary school. A perfectly seared piece of fish rested exactly 45 seconds before plating, its skin catching the overhead light like hammered bronze. Maya Johnson did not need applause. She needed the dish to be perfect, and her dishes were always perfect. She had started cooking as a teenager in her grandmother's kitchen in Georgia, where the rule was simple. You either learned to make something worth eating or you washed dishes. She had learned fast. By the time she was 22, she had worked in 3 Michelin-starred restaurants, apprenticed under a legendary French chef in Lyon, and developed a personal culinary philosophy that blended the depth of Southern American cooking with classical European technique and the quiet complexity of West African spice traditions. Her food told stories. It made people pause mid-bite, set down their fork, and look up at nothing in particular the way people do when they are trying to hold on to a feeling. Food critics, who had tasted her cooking, sometimes struggled to explain it in words. One had written simply, "You will remember this meal the way you remember the moment you first understood something true." She had framed that review, then quietly taken it off the wall a week later. She was not the kind of woman who needed to look at her own reflection. Her connection to Ethan Whitmore had begun 7 years ago, when she had been brought in as a temporary hire to prepare one private dinner for a man whose food preferences were, by all accounts, impossible to satisfy. She had heard the warnings before she accepted the assignment. 3 chefs before her had been dismissed within the first week, one after a single meal, one after a single course. Ethan Whitmore, the stories went, did not eat for pleasure. He ate with the exacting attention of a man who had encountered excellence in enough forms to recognize its absence immediately, and who found the absence intolerable. Maya had heard these warnings, and then, without much deliberation, set them aside. She did not cook to satisfy impossible men. She cooked to satisfy herself. And her standards, she knew, were higher than most. Ethan had returned his first plate. He had said nothing about the second. After the third course, a slow braised short rib with fig reduction and a barely there whisper of smoked cardamom, he had stood up from the table, walked to the kitchen door, and knocked. When Maya opened it, he had looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he had said, "You're the only one." She had not entirely understood what he meant until his personal assistant called the following morning with a contract. In 7 years, she had never been asked to cook for anyone else. She had never wanted to be. Ethan Whitmore was demanding and often cold, but he was honest, he was fair, and he treated her work with the kind of reverence that most people reserved for art. He had never once walked into her kitchen without knocking first. He had never interfered with her sourcing, her technique, her creative decisions. He had offered, once, a single note on a dish that she had later acknowledged to herself was correct, and then never mentioned it again. That was enough. In a world full of people who believed that writing a check entitled them to an opinion on everything, That was far more than enough. Tonight, the circumstances were unusual. The executive chef for Whitmore Tower's formal events, a man named Daniel, who had held the role for 4 years, had called in with an emergency, some family crisis that had pulled him away without warning. The banquet was already in motion, 40 confirmed guests, a 6-course menu already designed, suppliers already paid. Ethan's assistant had called Maya in a panic. Maya had taken exactly 2 minutes to consider the situation before agreeing to step in. She was not being asked to abandon her standards. She was being asked to maintain them under pressure. That was not a new experience. She coordinated the kitchen staff quickly and quietly, redistributed responsibilities, tasted every sauce herself, and by 7 in the evening had the service running with the smooth, invisible efficiency of a well-maintained clock. None of the guests who streamed into the dining room that night were told about the change in staffing. None of them asked. None of them would have thought to ask. The staff working the floor knew who Maya was. They moved around her with the careful deference of people who understood that the person at the center of things is not always the loudest one in the room. Outside, a black luxury car rolled to a stop at the entrance of the tower. The driver stepped out quickly, moved to the rear door, and pulled it open. The woman who emerged did so slowly, deliberately, in the manner of someone who had long ago decided that the world could wait for her. She wore a cream-colored blazer over a silk blouse, her hair pulled into a severe chignon that gave her sharp features an even sharper edge. She was 41 years old, the founder of Hale Ventures, one of the largest private real estate development firms in the region. Her name was Victoria Hale, and from the moment she stepped across the threshold of Whitmore Tower, she began taking stock of everything around her with the same appraising eye she turned on properties she was considering demolishing. Victoria Hale had built her company through a combination of genuine business acumen and a personality that had never once been accused of warmth. She had grown up with money, had multiplied it, and had somewhere along the way arrived at the unexamined conviction that wealth was not merely a circumstance, but a verdict proof of something fundamentally superior about herself. She was not cruel in the way that required conscious effort. She was cruel in the lazier, more durable way. She simply did not consider that the people who served her were fully real. Waiters, drivers, housekeepers, kitchen staff, these were a category, not individuals. They existed to perform a function. When they performed it adequately, she ignored them. When they fell short, she made her displeasure known without restraint or hesitation, because she had never once faced a consequence for doing so. Tonight, she had come to Whitmore Tower with the anticipation of solidifying a major development deal. She was confident. She was always confident. She entered the private dining room and paused at the threshold, surveying it with the expression of someone who has been promised a great deal and is reserving judgment. The room was beautiful. She acknowledged this the way a general acknowledges good weather, a minor tactical advantage, nothing more. A young staff member approached with a welcoming smile and moved to take her coat. Victoria let the coat slide from her shoulders without looking at the young woman, the garment simply falling into the space where she expected hands to be. She moved toward the center of the room, past clusters of other early arrivals, who turned to acknowledge her with the careful, calibrated warmth of people who understood that tonight's room was full of individuals worth knowing. Victoria accepted these small social gestures with the ease of long practice. She was good at this part. She smiled just enough, said the right things, positioned herself with the practiced precision of someone who understood that rooms like this were not merely social occasions, but arenas. The trouble began at the edge of the room, near the service corridor, when a young server named Marcus, 20 years old, 3 weeks on the job, doing his very best, lost his footing on a slightly uneven patch of floor while carrying a tray of sparkling water. He recovered almost immediately. Only a few drops landed near Victoria's heel. He turned to her with a face full of horrified apology. "I'm so sorry, ma'am." Victoria cut him off before he could finish the sentence. Her voice was not particularly loud, but it carried a kind of cold precision that made the surrounding conversations go still. She told him that his clumsiness was unacceptable. She told him that people who could not manage the basic task of carrying a tray probably should not be managing anything at all. She told him that she expected better from a venue of this caliber, and that someone should be held accountable. Marcus stood very still, his face a careful mask over what was clearly profound humiliation. Maya had been near the kitchen entrance when she heard the shift in the room. She had been in enough high stakes environments to read the emotional temperature of a space from 30 feet away. She walked over calmly, positioned herself gently between Victoria and Marcus, and addressed Victoria with a composure so complete it could have been mistaken for indifference. She apologized for any disruption to the guest's experience. She assured her that the evening service would be flawless. She was measured, professional, entirely without servility. She was not bowing, she was managing. Victoria looked at her for the first time. Her eyes traveled from Maya's face to the white chef's coat, taking in the small embroidered detail at the breast pocket, the careful posture, the stillness. Something about that stillness seemed to irritate Victoria slightly, the way one is irritated by a door that won't open the way you push it. She said nothing more, but as Maya turned back toward the kitchen, Victoria's gaze lingered, and in it was something that Maya had seen before, that particular species of contempt that was less about the individual than about the category. The look that said, "I have already decided what you are." Victoria said it quietly, almost to herself, as Maya walked away. A murmur that she perhaps intended for no one in particular, or perhaps intended for everyone. That's exactly where people like that belong. In the kitchen. The woman standing beside her pretended not to hear. A few others in the nearby radius exchanged brief, uncomfortable glances. Marcus, who had remained where he stood, absorbed the words with a stillness that told its own story. None of them said anything. The moment passed. The evening continued. The first 5 courses of the dinner went beautifully. Maya had designed a menu that moved through textures and flavors with the controlled momentum of a well-told story. A cold amuse-bouche of compressed melon with prosciutto and a single drop of aged balsamic. A bisque so silken it barely seemed to be liquid. A composed salad with roasted beets, pistachio, and a goat cheese mousse that vanished on the tongue. The compliments arrived steadily from the dining room, passed through the service corridor by the floor staff, with the quiet satisfaction of people who knew they were part of something excellent. Maya registered each one and then returned her attention entirely to the next dish. She was, in the truest sense, present. She was nowhere else. The 6th course, the main, was a lamb preparation that had taken Maya the better part of 2 weeks to perfect. She had sourced the lamb from a small farm, whose methods she trusted implicitly, had developed a crust of herbs and toasted spices pressed into the surface, with a technique she had refined over years, and had paired it with a white bean puree and a lamb juice that she had reduced slowly, obsessively, until it tasted like the memory of something beloved. She plated each portion herself, taking the same care with the 22nd plate as she had taken with the first. When the trays moved out through the service doors and into the dining room, she exhaled slowly and stood still for a moment, the way she always did in the space between preparation and response. She had done her job. Now the food would speak. The dining room received the main course with a silence that was, itself, a kind of applause. Conversations slowed. Utensils moved with unusual deliberateness. Ethan Whitmore's guests, people who had eaten in the finest restaurants on 4 continents, were, for a few minutes, simply and completely focused on what was on their plates. And then, from a table near the center of the room, a voice rose above the quiet. Victoria Hale set her fork down with a sharp, deliberate click against the rim of her plate. She pressed her napkin to her lips. She looked around the table at the other guests with an expression of composed displeasure. She announced that the lamb was oversalted. She said this in the tone of someone issuing a formal ruling. A man across the table from her, a property developer who had known Victoria professionally for almost a decade, continued eating. He said that, on the contrary, the seasoning was exceptional. Victoria did not acknowledge his opinion. She said it again, oversalted, and not what one would expect from an event of this stature. The couple beside her tasted their own portions and exchanged a small, puzzled look. One of them shook her head very slightly in Victoria's direction. None of this deterred Victoria. She pushed her plate half an inch forward, the universal signal of rejection, and raised her hand to summon a member of the floor staff. The young woman who appeared was composed, courteous, and internally alarmed in the way that all of Ethan Whitmore's staff were alarmed when something was going wrong at one of his events. She listened to Victoria's complaint. She offered, gently, to relay the feedback to the kitchen. Victoria said that she did not want the feedback relayed. She wanted to speak to whoever was responsible for this dish directly, right now, in front of everyone. There was a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation from the floor staff. Then they went to get Maya. Maya walked out of the kitchen with the same measured stride she always used. She approached Victoria's table without hurry. She introduced herself simply, first name only, and asked if she could help. Victoria looked at her. Then she looked at the rest of the table. Then back at Maya. She launched into a detailed, escalating critique of the dish. The seasoning, she said, was a sign of inexperience. The plating was overcrowded. The sauce was too heavy for the lamb's natural flavor. She spoke loudly enough that the tables around her had gone quiet. She seemed to gain energy from the audience. Maya listened to the entire speech without interrupting. When Victoria finished, Maya said, quietly, that she understood the guests' concern and that she would be happy to prepare a different dish if the lamb was not to her satisfaction. She did not defend the seasoning. She did not apologize for the lamb. She offered an alternative. It was a masterclass in de-escalation, and it infuriated Victoria completely. Victoria stood up. She stood up the way someone stands up when they have decided that sitting down is no longer compatible with the point they are trying to make. She said that she did not want a different dish. She said that what she wanted was for someone to admit that the food was substandard and that this kitchen should not be serving a room like this. She pointed at Maya when she said this kitchen. The finger extended toward Maya's chest, trembling slightly with the particular energy of someone who has mistaken their own anger for authority. Maya stood absolutely still. She did not step back. She did not step forward. She held Victoria's gaze with the calm, watchful attention of someone who had long since stopped being frightened by raised voices. The dining room was entirely silent. Every face had turned toward them. And then Victoria's hand moved. It was not a long motion. It was short and sharp and shockingly fast, the kind of physical gesture that, once completed, hangs in the air for a moment before anyone in the room can process what has just happened. The sound of it filled the space, a clean, devastating crack that rang off the marble walls and the crystal and the polished glass. Maya's head moved to one side. For a fraction of a second, nothing in the room moved at all. Then Maya turned her face slowly back to center. Her expression had not changed. She did not put her hand to her cheek. She did not speak. She simply looked at Victoria Hale with the same quiet, unflinching steadiness she had maintained since the beginning of this encounter. And in that stillness was something that the room, collectively, could feel without being able to name. Victoria stood with her hand at her side, breathing slightly faster than before. A strange look passed across her face. Not regret, not exactly, but the first faint awareness that the room's silence had a different quality now than it had a few seconds ago. She recovered quickly. She straightened her blazer. She lifted her chin. She said what she said, as if it were the verdict at the end of a long and obvious argument. She said, "You should know where you stand." No one moved. No one spoke. The 22 most powerful people in the room, individuals who negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, who had weathered corporate crises and public scandals and market collapses, sat completely still, and none of them said a single word. Maya looked at Victoria for a long moment. Then she reached out, picked up the nearest serving tray, and set it down carefully on the edge of the service station. She turned back to Victoria, and she said something in a voice so quiet that the nearest tables had to lean in almost imperceptibly to hear it. She said, "Are you certain you want to continue this?" Victoria blinked. The question was so measured, so utterly without emotion, that it created a strange vacuum in the room. Victoria laughed a short, dismissive sound, aimed at the audience as much as at Maya. She turned toward the nearest member of the floor staff and said that she wanted to speak to the manager immediately, and that this woman needed to be removed from the premises. The floor staff did not move right away. Victoria's eyes narrowed. She said it again. She wanted the manager, and she wanted this woman. She pointed at Maya again. Gone. One of the senior floor supervisors, a man who had worked this room for 11 years, exchanged a glance with a colleague. It was a glance that communicated several things simultaneously, none of which could be said aloud. He turned to address Victoria with professional courtesy and told her that he would look into the situation right away. He did not move toward Maya. He moved toward his earpiece. The room had returned to a kind of strained, performative normalcy. Glasses were lifted. Low conversations resumed. The surface of the evening was smoothed back into place by the social instincts of people who were very good at pretending everything was fine when it was not. But beneath that surface, the tension was absolute. A few guests near Victoria's table had quietly repositioned their chairs. The couple who had contradicted Victoria's complaint about the seasoning were now focused entirely on their plates. Victoria sat with the erect posture of someone who has declared a victory and is waiting for it to be ratified. Maya had not moved from where she stood. She remained in the room, neither confronting nor retreating, present in the way that certain kinds of stillness are present, heavy, unmistakable, impossible to dismiss. Then the security personnel near the main entrance received a transmission through his earpiece. He touched the piece with one finger, listened, and the expression on his face changed in the way that faces change when the nature of a situation suddenly becomes clear. It was not alarm. It was something closer to the resignation of someone who has just realized that a minor incident is not minor at all. He straightened. He looked across the room toward the service entrance. He began to move. Ethan Whitmore was not a man who made an entrance. He was a man whose presence simply arrived, the way pressure arrives before a storm gradually, then all at once, and with the quality of something that cannot be undone. He was 54 years old, lean and unhurried, in the way of someone who had not been in a physical hurry for decades, because the world had long since arranged itself to accommodate his pace. He wore a dark suit, no tie, and the kind of watchful intelligence in his eyes that made most people feel, when he looked at them, that they were being read rather than seen. He had arrived 40 minutes earlier than his scheduled appearance at the dinner, having concluded a meeting downtown more quickly than anticipated. He had been told, in the car, that the evening was running smoothly. He had received no additional information before stepping off the private elevator and into the corridor outside the dining room. The room registered his arrival within 3 seconds. Conversations paused, then restructured themselves around his presence, the way iron filings restructure themselves around a magnet. Several guests stood. A few moved toward him immediately, with extended hands and practiced smiles. Ethan moved through the greetings with an efficiency that was not rudeness. He acknowledged each person, made contact, said the minimum necessary, and no more, but his attention was already moving past them, into the room, taking its temperature the way he always took it, systematically, without expression. He noticed the unnatural stillness near the center tables. He noticed the position of several of his senior staff, their faces carrying that particular brand of composed anxiety that told him something had gone wrong. He moved toward the center of the room, and as he did, he saw Maya. She was standing 6 feet from a woman he recognized as Victoria Hale. Maya's posture was as controlled as he had ever seen it. Her face was turned toward him slightly now, and across her left cheek there was a mark, a redness, that was unmistakable in its shape, its cause, its meaning. Ethan Whitmore stopped walking. The guests who had been trailing toward him also stopped, uncertain. The room went quiet, in a way it had not been quiet before. Not the ordinary quiet of a room waiting for someone to speak, but the held breath quiet of a room that understood something irrevocable had happened, and was waiting to learn what it meant. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He looked at the room, and then he asked a single question in the tone of a man who asks questions he already knows the answer to, but asks them anyway because the asking is part of the accounting. He said, "Who did this?" Nobody answered. The seconds stretched out in the silence. Maya looked at him, but did not speak. Several guests looked at their hands or their glasses. A young server near the wall opened his mouth, then closed it, Then one of the senior floor supervisors, the man who had been managing the situation before Ethan arrived, stepped forward and, without embellishment, without blame or editorial, described what had occurred. He described the complaint about the food. He described the escalation. He described the moment when Victoria Hale had struck Maya Johnson across the face in front of the entire room. He finished speaking. Ethan looked at Maya. She met his eyes. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, confirming what had been said, without adding to it. Ethan Whitmore's face did something that very few people in that room had ever seen it do. It did not collapse or contort. It simply went cold entirely. Absolutely cold, in the way that deep water goes cold. Not at the surface, not dramatically, but all the way down to a place that has never seen sunlight. He turned and looked at Victoria Hale directly for the first time. Victoria, who had spent the last several minutes rebuilding her composure, under the assumption that Ethan's arrival was an opportunity for alliance, had already begun forming the sentence she intended to say. She had met Ethan at two previous industry events. She had cultivated what she believed was a collegial relationship. She had, in her assessment of the situation, done nothing that men and women of consequence did not do regularly in rooms exactly like this one. She was ready to explain. She took a breath and began. She said that she was sorry for the disturbance and that she gestured lightly toward Maya. She said, "It's only a cook." The dining room went quiet in a way that had a texture to it, the way fabric goes quiet when it is stretched past its limit. Ethan let the words land and settle. Then he said, "No," one syllable, complete. He did not elaborate immediately. He let the word hold the room for a moment, the way a rest holds a piece of music, not an absence, but a presence of its own. Then he spoke again. He spoke in the deliberate, measured way of someone who is not performing his anger, but is expressing it with the precision of a man who understands that clarity is a more devastating weapon than volume. He told the room who Maya Johnson was. He told them that for 7 years, she had been the sole architect of every meal he had eaten in his private residence, every dinner meeting, every personal occasion. Every morning he had begun with something on a plate that was not merely food, but the product of extraordinary care and craft. He told them that she had cooked for 3 heads of state when they had visited at his invitation, that she had been offered positions at two of the most prestigious restaurants in Europe and had declined both, and that she was, without qualification, the most gifted culinary professional he had ever encountered in a life that had given him access to many. He told them that she had agreed, as a personal favor to him and his staff, to step in and manage this entire dinner at one day's notice, and that the quality of every dish they had eaten tonight was entirely her achievement. He told them, finally, that in 7 years he had never permitted anyone to disrespect the people who worked for him, and that this would not be the occasion on which he began. The room was absolutely silent. Victoria's face had gone through 3 distinct expressions in the span of 30 seconds: confidence, then confusion, then something that began as denial and was slowly becoming something else. Around her, the social landscape of the evening had shifted with the speed and totality of a tide turning. The guests who had been seated near her were no longer making eye contact. The man who had disagreed with her about the lamb was now looking at the table with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has waited for the correct version of events to become official. Victoria looked at Ethan. She was still standing. She had not, in all of this, sat back down. And her standing now had the wrong quality, no longer authoritative, but exposed. Word spread through the room with the organic, unstoppable momentum that only social catastrophe produces. As the evening continued shakily, slowly regaining its forward motion like a train resuming speed after an emergency stop, guests began, quietly, to compare notes. And what emerged was not a single incident, but a pattern, assembled from fragments that had been waiting, separately, for a context in which to mean something. A woman who ran a hospitality group described an incident 2 years ago at a charity gala where she had watched Victoria reduce a young parking attendant to tears over a 2-minute delay in retrieving her car. A man who had been on a board with Victoria's company described a meeting where she had publicly berated her own executive assistant for a scheduling error in front of a room full of peers, then denied. Having done so, afterward, someone at the far end of the room mentioned a video. It had circulated briefly in a professional network a year ago, a clip recorded on a phone, in a restaurant, of a woman berating a waiter with a specificity and cruelty that had made it briefly notorious before being removed. Several people around the table recognized the description immediately. Several people confirmed it was Victoria. Her business partners at the table began making the small, barely perceptible social adjustments that signal the withdrawal of support. The slight turning of a body away, the sudden interest in a phone, the carefully worded excuse to speak to someone on the other side of the room. Two men who had come to this dinner, specifically to discuss a joint development project with Victoria Hale, quietly moved toward Ethan and began a separate conversation. Victoria watched this from where she stood, and in her face, now, was the look of someone watching a wall they built themselves come apart, brick by brick, and understanding that they have no mechanism to stop it. Ethan's team moved quietly and efficiently through the next hour. His chief counsel, who was present at the dinner, had a brief, private conversation with two of the guests who had confirmed Victoria's past conduct. His assistant documented the evening's events with the focused attention of someone who understood that documentation was a form of power. The dinner's other investors, three of whom had been in early discussions with Hale Ventures on a major urban redevelopment project, were drawn into a cluster of conversation with Ethan that lasted 20 minutes and ended with the particular silence of a consensus reached. By the time the dessert course arrived, a composed chocolate preparation that would, under any other circumstances, have been the most memorable thing about the evening. The professional calculus of the room had been completely and irreversibly altered. Ethan announced at the end of the meal that all active negotiations with Hale Ventures were suspended pending review. He said this with the same controlled flatness he had used throughout the evening: no drama, no visible satisfaction. Just the statement of a decision made by a man who made decisions for a living. Within the hour, two other firms represented at the table had communicated similar pauses in their conversations with Victoria's company. The stock of Hale Ventures, which traded on a mid-tier exchange, would not register the impact until the following morning. But those in the room who understood markets understood that what had been decided tonight would be visible in numbers within 48 hours. Victoria's firm was not small, it was not fragile, but it had been built, in significant part, on relationships, on the confidence of partners who believed that Victoria Hale was the kind of person they could be associated with. Tonight, that confidence had not been shaken, it had been publicly revoked. Victoria attempted, toward the end of the evening, to speak to Ethan privately. His assistant intercepted the request with professional courtesy and a finality that was unmistakable. Victoria stood for a moment in the corridor outside the dining room and understood with a clarity that felt physical, like a change in air pressure, like the first cold moment of an October morning, that the meeting she had traveled here to accomplish was not going to happen tonight or next week, or very possibly ever. She had spent years constructing a version of herself that was, in professional settings, nearly impervious to consequences. She had made enemies, had attracted criticism, had been described in private conversations by words she would have rejected furiously if she had heard them. She had also, always, survived. There was always another deal. There was always another room. She had believed, walking in tonight, that this room was simply the next one. She understood now that she had miscalculated, and the understanding had a weight she had not anticipated. She turned then toward Maya, who was near the service entrance, overseeing the last of the kitchen cleanup. She approached. Her gait had changed entirely. The precise, proprietary stride was gone, replaced by something more careful, more effortful, as if the floor beneath her had become uncertain. She stood near Maya and said her name. Maya turned. Victoria said that she owed her an apology. She said that what she had done was wrong. She said it with the cadence of someone reciting words they have understood, intellectually, to be the correct words in this situation. She said she hoped that Maya could accept it. Maya looked at her for a long moment. She was not unkind. She was not angry. She was simply, genuinely, and unmistakably honest. She said she heard what Victoria had said, and then she said that she had been in enough rooms, for long enough, to know the difference between a person who was sorry for what they had done and a person who was sorry for what it had cost them. She said that she was not yet certain which one Victoria was. She said that what had happened tonight, not merely the slap, but everything before it, every dismissal, every murmured contempt, every moment in which a person was treated as less than human because of the clothes they wore or the work they did, was not the kind of thing that a single apology, offered in the aftermath of consequences, had the power to repair. She said that she had known, from the time she was young, what it felt like to walk into a room and be decided about before she opened her mouth. She had learned, over years, to carry that knowledge without letting it make her smaller. She had worked hard. She had refused to let other people's ceilings become her own. And she had arrived at a place where none of that history was visible on her surface, because she had chosen to let her work speak for her every single day without asking for permission or acknowledgement from anyone who had not earned the right to give it. She said that she did not know whether Victoria would understand what that cost, or what it was worth, or what it meant to have it dismissed with a single contemptuous gesture in a room full of people. She said that she was going to take the time she needed to make that choice, not tonight, in a room full of people, with everything still raw and the whole evening still unfinished, under the kind of pressure that produced performances rather than truths. She said this quietly, without heat, without cruelty, looking Victoria directly in the eye. She said it the way she said everything, with absolute unhurried conviction. Victoria stood there for a moment, after Maya had finished speaking. Something moved across her face, something more complicated than the evening's earlier expressions, something that might, given enough time and privacy, develop into actual understanding. But that would be elsewhere, in some other room, on some other night. It was not here. She nodded once. She turned. She walked toward the exit of the dining room, and as she walked, the room around her, which had, 2 hours ago, been filled with people who would have been glad to speak to her, offered her nothing but the blank courtesy of strangers. No one stopped her. No one reached out. One or two people acknowledged her exit with the small, neutral nods you give someone you recognize but have decided, for now, to know only distantly. She collected her coat without looking at the young woman who handed it to her. And then she was gone, out through the lobby, and into the elevator, and down into the city, where the night continued without her. The dining room settled into a different kind of quiet after she left the quiet of something that has been resolved, or at least completed. Ethan stood at the head of the room and addressed his guests briefly. He thanked them for the evening. He said that the food had been exceptional. And then he did something that, for those who knew him well, was as remarkable as anything else that had happened. He stopped a member of the floor staff who was passing with an empty tray and said, loudly enough for the room to hear, that he would like the chef brought out. There was a brief pause. Then Maya walked in from the service corridor. She looked at the room. The room looked at her. And then, one by one, and then all at once, the guests stood. The applause began the way all real applause begins, not on cue, not orchestrated, but from the simple, instinctive, irresistible recognition of something that is genuinely true. It started at one table and moved through the room like a wave. And by the time it reached its full expression, it had absorbed everyone in it. Every collected billionaire and executive and power broker and industry titan, all of them on their feet, all of them paying the kind of tribute that, in that room, in that company, was the rarest and most sincere currency available. Several people moved forward with business cards, with quiet words, with the kind of interest that meant something professionally real. A woman who ran a global hospitality brand leaned close and said something into Maya's ear that made Maya's expression shift only slightly, only briefly towards something that might, in another woman, have been called joy. Maya accepted each acknowledgement with a nod, a measured smile, the unhurried grace of someone who is moved but not overwhelmed. She did not seek the center of the room. She did not linger in the spotlight longer than courtesy required. She thanked the guests for the evening. She thanked Ethan, briefly, with a directness that required no embellishment. And then, with the same quiet efficiency with which she had arrived, she turned and went back through the service door, back into the kitchen. Her kitchen, tonight, for these hours, and returned to the work she had always loved more than any applause it might earn. In the kitchen, the sound from the dining room was muffled, but present a warm, sustained vibration that moved through the walls like a current. Maya stood at the central prep station and began the end of service work with the same careful attention she brought to everything. Inventory checked, equipment cleaned, surfaces wiped to the standard that had always been her standard and no one else's. Around her, the junior kitchen staff worked in the particular silence of people who had witnessed something and were still processing it. No one said much. One of the younger cooks, a woman barely 20, who had started 2 months ago, and who had watched the entire evening's events from the service corridor with wide, unblinking eyes, moved to stand beside Maya as she wiped down the stainless prep surface. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then, quietly, she asked if Maya was all right. Maya looked at her. She said yes. Then she added, "You will be too, when it's your turn." The young woman nodded slowly, not entirely sure what it meant, but understanding enough to fold it carefully away for later. The sounds of the kitchen, the soft running of water, the percussion of stainless steel, the last hissing of a burner going cold, filled the space with the ordinary music of work that has been done and done well. She thought about the evening as she worked. She thought about Victoria Hale and the look on her face at the end, not the earlier expressions, not the contempt or the fury or the shocked collapse of certainty, but the last one, the complicated one. She had seen that expression before, on different faces, in different rooms, the expression of a person who has lived entirely inside a set of assumptions and has, for the first time, been placed outside them and made to look at them from the other direction. Whether that experience translated into genuine change or merely into resentment was something no one could predict from the outside, and Maya had long since stopped believing it was her role to try. She had said what was true. She had said it clearly, without cruelty, without performance, and without the false comfort of a forgiveness she was not yet ready to give. What Victoria did with that truth was Victoria's work, and the accounting for it would happen in private, over time, in ways that Maya would probably never witness. She did not need to witness it. She did not know what Victoria Hale would do with the experience of tonight. She did not know whether it would change anything, whether it would become one of those moments that a person carries forward and, slowly, allows to alter them, or whether it would calcify, instead, into grievance, into the conviction that she had been wronged, and that the world owed her a recalibration. Both were possible. Both happened. Maya knew that her own opinion of Victoria's sincerity was not a moral verdict and not a prediction. It was simply an honest assessment, offered at the moment it was sought, with the same precision she brought to everything else. She thought about Ethan, his face, when he had seen her cheek, the 7 words he had used to cut through the entire evening's architecture of confusion and complicity. She thought about the staff who had known who she was and had not been permitted to say so, who had stood in that difficult, wordless middle ground between loyalty and conscience. She thought about Marcus, the young server, and made a note to speak to him directly tomorrow and tell him what she had probably not said often enough, that his composure tonight had been remarkable, and that it was a skill worth more than he knew. She thought, finally, about the mark on her cheek. It had faded to a faint warmth by now. It would be gone by morning. The incident would remain, would be documented, would have consequences that unspooled outward from this evening for months, in ways she could not entirely anticipate. But the mark itself, the physical evidence of the specific individual moment, would disappear by sunrise, and she found that she did not need it to remain. She did not need to carry the wound in order to know what it had meant. She knew what it had meant. She would always know. The kitchen came to its final quiet. The last burner was off. The last surface was clean. Maya hung her chef's coat on the hook inside the door. She would take it home to launder herself, as she always did, and changed into the plain, dark jacket she had worn on the way in. She picked up her bag from the small shelf above the coat hooks. She stood in the now empty kitchen for a moment, in the particular stillness that only kitchens have after service is over. When the heat has begun to dissipate and the space reasserts its fundamental nature, a place of creation. She looked at the counters, the equipment, the orderly arrangement of tools that, in skilled hands, could produce things that moved people in ways that all the money in the world could not manufacture. She looked at it the way you look at something you love, without performance, without self consciousness, with the simple, deep acknowledgement of a thing that matters. Then she walked out of the kitchen, down the service corridor, and into the elevator. She rode it alone to the lobby. She stepped out into the city, where the night air had cooled to that particular temperature that makes a person feel, briefly, that the world is larger and more forgiving than it appeared an hour ago. She did not hail a car immediately. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the lit windows of the tower above her, at the street below her, at the ordinary and extraordinary fact of a city continuing to be itself without requiring anything of her. Somewhere above her, in a room of marble and crystal and expensive ambition, the applause had finally faded. The guests had gathered their things. The evening was closing, and here she was, on the sidewalk, in her plain, dark jacket, nobody's symbol and nobody's lesson, just Maya Johnson, 32 years old, who had gotten up this morning and done her job, and done it better than almost anyone alive, and who was now going home. Status does not grow in the kitchen. It does not depend on the size of the room or the price of the wine or the names on the guest list. It is built in the same way that anything real is built through years of ordinary days, through the sustained application of care and skill to work that most people never see, through the quiet decision, made again and again, to do the thing you love to the highest standard you are capable of reaching, regardless of whether anyone is watching. What happened in that dining room tonight was not a story about victory or defeat, about the powerful and the powerless, about one woman's humiliation and another's vindication. It was a story about what is actually true and how long it takes, sometimes, for the truth to become visible in the places where it was always present. Dignity is not a thing that can be conferred. It is not a title, not a position, not a number in an account. It cannot be given to you by someone else's recognition of it, and it cannot be taken from you by someone else's refusal to see it. It exists before the room fills and after the room empties, and it belongs, always, entirely to the person who has chosen to live inside it.